So, revolutionise the food system in 10 minutes. I might not be able to do that, but I think it would be useful. What I want to come out of this presentation is to introduce another important centre of spending power within the local economy, which has got the potential to change things, which is the supermarkets. Much less discussed in public sector procurement. So I'm going to go over some of the findings from recent CRESC research on supermarket supply chains and try and introduce a few ideas about how we can think about supermarkets differently and the role they play in the local economy, and how we might start to look at different things they might do. So first of all, why supermarkets matter? Well, because they're absolutely huge. They're taking in £1 billion of household spending every week, about 4/5 of total spending on most major food products, and 3/4 of this is going through the big four supermarkets: Asda, Morrison's, Tesco's and Sainsbury's. So because supermarkets' cost of sales as a percentage of their revenue is very high, they're huge buyers of products, and because they're huge buyers, like local councils, they've got the power to shape whole sectors of the economy themselves. They shape local and national employment, and they shape manufacturing, and they shape agriculture. So they're the largest private sector employer in what we call the foundation economy. There's about 1 million people employed in supermarkets, about 800,000 of those in the big four. But more interestingly, there's about 836,000 jobs in food manufacturing, agriculture, fishing, 80% of the produce of which is going into supermarkets. These jobs are dependent on the way the supermarkets behave. But the really interesting thing is when you look at it, no matter kind of what income group you're in, or no matter where in the country you're living, on average people tend to spend a very similar amount of money at the supermarket. So this is by income quintile, and as you'll see at the bottom row, across the income groups, spending per person per week is very similar. And what this means is when supermarkets are allowed into an area, what they're essentially being given access to is a license to impose a tithe on the local population, because most of the people are going to be shopping there, most of the people are going to be giving about 10% of their weekly spend to the local supermarket. So they have a good alibi for why they should be allowed this tithe, and it's been pretty resilient over the years despite all the controversies. The first one is, whilst they have pretty good rewards for shareholders over the years, they also have superficially low prices for customers. I mean, obviously if you introduce a different accounting frame looking at things like environmental costs, the prices on the packages might look a lot higher. But superficially, they have low prices, and on a local level, they have the alibi about bringing investment in jobs, often in areas where there's not much else going. This has kept them safe from serious government intervention. There's constant inquiries by people like the Competition Commission and OFT, but within a kind of standard economics frame of looking at market collusion, you can't really touch them. And to ease tensions, they're able to do fairly effective CSR stunts, put lots of Union Jack stickers on the produce, and bring up various farmers who are happy with the way they're being treated. But the reality of it, really, when you look on a local level, and this is taking some of the calculations done with Alan Sitkin in the case of Enfield, the reality on a local level is massive extraction from the local economy, because it's a business model where goods get trucked in and the money gets trucked out. And it's quite a lot of money, 25 million across the big five there, as Morrison's isn't so big down south. And in return, it's very tokenistic, scattershot CSR. £6,000 a year for community matters in Enfield, £26,000 for the local school, but it all pales into insignificance in terms of the amount going out. So the question for local authorities should really be, if they're taking that much out, what are they putting back in? And what some of the demands should be is firstly, not meaning this voluntary CSR, but something approaching a kind of levy on supermarkets in a local area. Obviously, a lot of governments won't have the power to do this, but I know it's something that Enfield have been looking at how this might be possible. And I mean, our calculations in the case of Wales, if a 5% levy was to be put on the big four supermarket profits for Wales, you'd get £12 million a year, which is more than the Welsh Assembly is currently spending on homelessness. So this could be not insignificant sums. Secondly is that major employers in many areas, they should be forced into making better commitments in terms of the living wage. In the same way that public sector procurement are now starting to look at the supply chains, deeper into the supply chains and what the kind of working conditions and local procurement is there. The same can be done with supermarkets. And that brings to the third point, is when you're looking at local food production schemes, with kind of 80% of household grocery spend going through the supermarkets, they're the key kind of demand anchor which could make local food production go onto a kind of mass scale. If it's ever going to happen, then along with public sector procurement, there needs to be some kind of way of getting the mass retailers on board. Instead, the reality of what we have is wrecked supply chains. So a lot of our research is focused really on the relationship between supermarkets and food manufacturers. And if you're looking at new manufacturing jobs for the ex-industrial regions, there's a tendency at the moment to focus on the high-tech, knowledge-intensive manufacturing sectors. But really, food manufacturing is the most important manufacturing sector in the UK. The table on the right, it's far and away the largest manufacturing sector in terms of sales, far and away in terms of employment. And if this manufacturing sector could be made to work better than it currently is, then you could get all kinds of positive knockover effects elsewhere, including job creation, but also building local supply chains around things like machine tools, for which food manufacturers are a major buyer, most of them coming from places like Germany and Italy at the moment. But what's happening to the food processors is they're kind of getting squashed between the political and cultural capital of the farmers, who are much better than the manufacturers at pressing their case with politicians and with the media, and between the buying power of the supermarkets. So I mean, this is an illustrative example of the price of a pint of milk, where you've kind of got a situation where farmers' input costs have been rising, with grain prices over the last few years. They've had their share going up. Supermarkets are wanting to push prices down for consumers, but also protect their margins. And it's the manufacturers in the middle that are getting squashed. And when you look across food manufacturers, unless they've got some really good branded products, then they're mostly in a pretty dire state of hardly making money, usually loss-making. And this has a lot of negative consequences for them. They're facing a situation of being constantly under threat by supermarkets threatening to switch suppliers. So they're not able to use their factories to the full extent. They have idle equipment, idle workforces, waste investment, inefficiency, and all this builds into a huge trade deficit with other parts of Europe, because supermarket buying practices have made British food manufacturers so inefficient that it becomes cheaper to start buying stuff of Denmark and the Netherlands and Germany, where wages are often a lot higher, but production costs are a lot lower because they're able to keep demand running through their factories. So in terms of alternatives, there's loads of different alternatives, I guess, to the status quo with supermarkets and food production, and some people here today working on them. I'd just bring attention to one of them as a way of saying that often these alternatives are kind of hidden in plain sight or in quite strange places, and one of them is the way Morrison's actually deals with many parts of its food procurement. It runs a vertically integrated supply chain in many of its key food areas, which is where it will own some of its suppliers. And what this means is that, as opposed to the independent food producers who don't know whether they're going to get orders from one month to the next, they know that they've got guaranteed demand flowing through their factory, and they're able to plan for the long term, they're able to use their capacity to the full, and they're able to also start looking more seriously at things like ethical sourcing and labour standards, which is something the other food manufacturers with this state of permanent instability are not really able to do. So the funny thing about this as well is it's for Morrison's a bit of a money spinner. They actually make an awful lot of money out of this and don't really talk about it very much at all. So the charts here, the red line for Niroc, which is one of their wholly owned meat processors. They do this in loads of areas across vegetables and fish, so expanding it quite rapidly. They've managed to get productivity per employee going through the roof compared to the other major processors in that sector without a cut in wages. And they've managed to start generating, the lower chart, a huge amount of cash. Now that can be used in a variety of ways. It could be used for profits for Morrison shareholders, it could be used for price cuts, or it could start being put into other things like making the supply chain much more environmentally sustainable. The options are there, is the point, is it gives you a degree of control over outcomes in the supply chain. So, as a way of conclusion, I'd say, given that what supermarkets are is basically a group that are licensed to take a tithe out of often very disadvantaged areas, they should be made to work a lot harder for such a privilege. Not only giving back more in return, but also acting as an anchor for local food production. And over the longer term, the bigger picture, British food manufacturing is in a terrible state because of supermarket buying practices playing suppliers off against one another. This is a false necessity because, as Morrison's have shown, you can do it differently and actually still make money from it. So it's a kind of cultural problem with supermarkets as much as an economic problem. So perhaps if national government aren't going to be the ones to pressure supermarkets to change on some of these things, then maybe local government can instead. Okay.